All right, Pat, Lynn, thank you for joining me on this eighth episode of the post show. We had guest Jermaine Fowler on this week. Amazing. He is exploding. He's got his book, he's got his podcast, he's got this community that he's created on his website, everywhere. As he said, check him out at all of his ats. I've been listening to that podcast and it's truly incredible. So if you haven't actually listened to his podcast, you really need to. And then come check out ours. Or actually check out ours first, since it's just one episode with him. And then go listen to all the hours and hours of contents he has. But I want
subscribe to both. Give them reviews.
Exactly. Yes.
You know, and if you think they're even okay, a 5-star goes a long way.
It does. Yeah. If you think they're okay, they're great. If you hate them, they're great. Add 5 stars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. 5 stars. You could do it ironically, right? Just ironically like something.
Yeah, you can just feel the irony. You don't have to write about it. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, when I go to and I give it a 5-star, that's ironic, right? Like that's a joke.
Exactly.
But I still gave them the 5-star.
Advertising.
So what we're getting at is Too Complicated for History is brought to you by. Can I say that? No, I can't.
I'm definitely going to bleep that.
Okay.
So no one will know what we're talking about. I'm just going to bleep all of the previously mentioned potential sponsors.
Exactly. They'll think we're just cursing, which is fine. I mean, that's fine.
That's plural.
All right. One thing we got into in the episode with Jermaine is that there is a huge difference between his podcast and his writings and our podcast, but that there are also similarities. I want to talk about the similarities between the two podcasts, and obviously let's talk about what some of the differences are. Lynn, I'm going to keep it vague like that, and I would love to have you weigh in on it, because there are some similarities that were mentioned in the episode in terms of how we're uncovering people. And even though to a different end, we are actively pursuing the unearthing of the humanity aspect of these historical figures. So can we talk a little bit about that, Lynn?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the similarity is, the main similarity is who we're looking at and the stories we're telling. So we're, too complicated for history because we want to tell stories that haven't been told before, or maybe they're a little messy and you can't just summarize them in one paragraph. There's contradictions just like everywhere in the world. We're as people, we're contradictory. We can do things that are really stupid, things that are really, we later on regret. It's not just as simple, here's what happened, the end. So we're trying to tell stories about people and things that really have been ignored and haven't been a part of the story. And that's actually a lot of what Jermaine Fowler is trying to do, because he's trying to take this narrative that we all learn in school that is, okay, we won the revolution, yay, slavery ended. Oh wait, no, we had a war, then slavery ended. So we like to just talk about these big topics without really digging in deep into what was actually happening. And so his book certainly revolves around Black history and how that has been ignored, because we tend to say slavery, but we're talking about individual human beings. So who were these individuals? How did they live their lives? Because that's important as well. And, he includes women, and he talks about essentially the people who haven't been focused on since the beginning of our history here in the United States. So he's adding different voices so that in the end, we have a more thorough story. We have all of the perspectives so we can understand the different angles and understand the story even better than we do now. It's not just sort of this flat, this happened, this date, the end, but we're trying to expand the understanding of history by giving different perspectives of it. And I think that's really important. And what he's doing that I absolutely love is that by calling it the Humanity Archive, he's also not focusing on our differences, but he's saying we all have humanity. So, even though it's important to focus sometimes on Black history, on, you know, women's history, on Native history, at the heart of it all is that we're all part of the same human species, and that's something that we really shouldn't forget.
Yeah. And that was, I mean, that's perfectly said. There's not much I can add to that. Jeez. But he does something really well, which is he reports about the big milestones in the history, right? But then he dives straight into the micro and gets the writings of a specific individual. And it really helps color what's happening at that time, and it's I listened to his episode on Japanese internment, being Japanese myself, and it was a lot of stuff I haven't heard. I learned that it happened. I knew that there were bad sentiments and things that had happened post, the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II. But I got to hear like the voice of Japanese Americans at the time. And it's a really beautiful thing. And he paints a wonderful picture. And, I think we try and do the same thing. We're just trying to show you that these people are complex, they're humans, and it allows us to relate to them. I mean, the Japanese internment, right? Just going specifically off of that episode is like that term Japanese internment is just like a weird, blurry event that happened in the US, and it's barely talked about anymore, like at all. And when you hear the stories of what someone went through, that changes your perspective. And now it's like, oh, I'm curious to know more about that person, or I'm curious to know more about those communities that existed at that time. And it connects you to the event versus remember the event. It happened.
Right.
It's not about that. It's about our connection. And that's, I think, the big goal of us and, hopefully most historians, especially nowadays, is let's establish that connection with the past. Because yes, there is Black history, Japanese history, white history. If you really look, in the scope of things, and not to generalize too broadly, but it is just history, right? Of course, there's specific subsections, and we will always go down those routes. You can't, compare our history to like Egyptian history or, early Chinese dynasty histories, right? Like they're very different things, but at the end of the day, they were also still people. And he does it beautifully. And it was so great to talk to him about it.
Yeah, it came up in the episode, a bunch about, this is human history. Mm-hmm. Eventually, or at least that was the goal, that this would all just become human history. And that's the story that we're telling. And that gets so complex because, as we've said in multiple episodes, both in the show and in this show, when you start adding the elements of humans, it gets complicated. So it's great. I mean, truly, I think we could do a dozen more episodes with him and still only scratch the surface, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. Another thing that came up in the episode, and kind of relating it back to a lot of the Washington stuff that we do, and of course, not to overstate it, but this is way too complicated even for a single podcast or a single post show. But I find this really interesting and uncomfortable, and I think we need to be okay with that. I'd love to get both of your opinions. Pat, we'll start with you. Is Washington... Isaac brought it up. Washington, when you're reading about him in one chapter, you go, this is the greatest man that ever lived. You turn the page, talk about how he owned all these slaves and how he felt about them, and you go, he's horrible. And it's come up before. I don't remember if it was someone from one of the interviews we did or what have you, where it's like both those things are true. And they look at you and go, complex, isn't it? Like, not trying to pacify it or smooth it over or even offer any ounce of solace on the fact that both those things are true. In one hand, you have this man who is a god in a sense that he's done so many great things. And then on the other hand, you have the same man who's done so many horrible things And how do you mix that oil and water? It doesn't. I don't know. I don't have more to say on it. I just want to get more comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've covered this, and it's just the idea of full context. Like that's what you need. And it's a full story. It's a full picture. We're not going to agree with what was done. We're not necessarily even going to give the past that, hey, it was just a product of the time, because there were other humans, like they say it in this particular podcast. They bring up that, there were others bucking the system when this was happening, right? Like there were abolitionists, there were people. We actually just had a really awesome conversation. So stay tuned for Bertrand. I'm not going to say his last name because I don't want to say it incorrectly, but stay tuned for our episode with Bertrand. It's coming up soon and it's awesome. And look, what it comes down to is we need self-reflection, and we have to do it honestly. We have to do it completely. And the only way to do it completely is to look at everything. The only way to not repeat the mistakes of the past is to see what the mistakes of the past were. Mm-hmm. And that's just what it comes down to, is we want to tell the whole picture, give everyone as much information as possible so they can make their own decisions, give them agency in it. And, giving us agency gives us the ability to better ourselves. And knowing they had agency also does, like, that gives us a reason to not excuse them for what they did, or to give them a round of applause for what they did, because it's just, we all have choices about what we can do, what we can say. And if you want to take things at surface value, if you want to, that's not what we do here. We look at it all. And again, we try not to put too much opinion behind what we're doing. Bias is going to happen no matter what, but that's wow.
Not me.
Executive producer Jordan Sloan. I am keeping this in the episode.
That better be
this episode brought to you by
brought to you by
another tech,
like Motorola. Where you at? And that's just what it comes. Anyway, like, really, to sum it all up, is it we have to. I know we can never say it enough. You have to have the full context to make informed decisions and move on from that.
Well, and let me expand a little bit before we hand it over to you, Lynn. Is, I use Washington as the example because that's who we're familiar with, among others, but particularly Washington. But this is true for a lot of people in history, right? Like in the episode, we talked about Genghis Khan, and like, how long is it before history, remembers him in one way and not another. The origin, of course, we all know that, of how Too Complicated for History got its name. This isn't just something that's applicable to one person, but truly everyone, even today's history that we're creating. Lynn, you mentioned social media in the episode, and how historians in 100 years from now will have to deal with that seesaw of humanity, and how people can be multiple things. You want to say something on that, even?
Well, I think the first important thing, the main thing that I was thinking of when Pat was talking, was that we all have these different sides of ourselves, and that one doesn't negate the other. So the fact that George Washington did all these great things, won a revolution, was our first president, does not negate the fact that he held human beings in slavery and, did some pretty horrible things. At the same time, the fact that he did those things doesn't take away the fact that he did win the Revolutionary War and he was the first president. And honestly, you can hate him as a human being. You can hate him as a person, say he was awful, he had no morals, while still acknowledging the things that he did that put our country where it is today. You can still love him and say that you think he's the best person that ever lived, but here's what he did that is very questionable, and clearly that was a dark mark on his, on his reputation. And so I think that seeing people multifaceted people is a good way to relate to them, just like Pat said. And that's really important, because that's how you make them go from being this marble or this painting to a human being. Um, and let's see, what was you were talking about social media
Well, yeah,
and
how historians
oh
of
yeah, heavens.
tomorrow might view today.
Oh,
And
they're gonna hate it. Yeah. In fact, I think we talked about this on the last
I
post
can't
show.
even imagine, because for us, I mean, if you're reading someone's letter, you have an idea who they're writing to. So if they're writing to, their wife, they're going to, or their husband, they're going to say, have a different tone than if they're writing to their boss.
Mhm.
Like what the audience, who the audience is, who's probably going to read it in addition to the receiver. And then from there, you can figure out how they're sort of toning the letter to put across how they want it to be perceived. With social media, you're just putting it out there for everyone. And, come
Very
on.
curated, though.
I mean,
Just to say,
very curated.
just really quick, there's definitely a Twitter account that I created at some point. It was like a random Twitter, and I only had the inspiration to tweet once. I'm not active on Twitter, or I'm not very active. And it was one Twitter, and it was a quote from a TV show, and it was just, the line is, hummus, thoughts? And that, like, that's a line from the show. And like, the response is, I have no, it's hummus. But some historian at some point is going to come across that tweet in all of the archives.
Yeah.
And that'll just exist. The stream of consciousness. What does that mean?
And
Well,
that could be
it's
all they
nonsense
know about you,
gobbledygook.
Pat. I mean, that
Right.
may be all. And so they have to create this whole perception around you
Right.
based on that.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
you know what was so interesting when I was listening to you guys talk about that in the episode is that episode, as you were talking about it, is part of the record as well, right? So it's
Right.
not just that you, Lynn, say something on Twitter and we have to interpret it. I have an episode of a podcast of you talking about said interpretation. So like we're looking at it as if they look at those things in a vacuum. And truly, there's so much digital footprint out there.
Right.
And I don't want to make this political, but that they'll have the context. I'll be able to see all sides of who Lynn was and what she thought on both ends of the thing.
I think I've had, and I don't tweet much anymore at all, but I think my total's like 7,000 or 8,000 tweets. No one wants to read all of that. And then if you want to do a whole, like, let's say you just want to do people who have their, master's degree from George Mason University, and then you have to read, you're probably going to be reading several million tweets. So it's almost, I'm happy that the sources for the 18th century and the 19th century are finite. They're limited, because I have no idea how any historian in 100 years is going to feel done with a project.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and also like at least we only have letters that we found in the back of desks and in family, chests and trunks. And the question then for that history, and we don't need to go spiraling down this future forward historian, those guys, but also what tweets have been saved? What tweets,
Right.
like, is there a hard drive with every tweet that's ever been deleted? Is there a,
Right.
is it going to be curated by the next owner of Twitter in 50 years? Is it,
Right.
What will still exist?
Well,
so, sure, you might have, and this comes back to, Jordan, your statement of like, they will have the context. Well, but they may not, right? So like, sure, assuming that they have the whole of everything, but even then, how do you even parse through the context of Lynn Price Robbins, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, with 7,000 tweets, all of her publishings, all of her videos, all of her podcasts? We have literal lifetimes of information now. And to study that within your own lifetime, how do you even encompass multiple people? So you're going to have to take shortcuts somewhere, or we're going to integrate AI into our brains, and that'll help us, just.
Yep,
and
you heard it here first.
It's done. Yeah.
I think what scares me the most is, will we ever get to the genuine individual that's behind all of these?
But is there?
I think that philosophically that is the correct question, Jordan.
Right.
But I totally understand what you're saying, Lynn.
Yeah.
Right. And well, philosophically, yes, is there. But is there even less of one now that we have all of this technology and are constantly under the eye of cameras and videos? I mean,
Yes.
if you're somewhere and you trip, that's going to be on TikTok.
Yeah.
That, you know what I mean? Whereas
I will say that I had a conversation with an A-list celebrity. I won't mention who they are. Just suffice to
Ooh
say
la
that
la.
they were A-list, and they said to me, I don't even know who I am. I feel like this person, they use their actual name, is just another character that I play. The not
Right.
character is a character that I play.
Mm.
And he wasn't being disingenuous or trying to say anything other than I am intentionally not being someone. So does that mean I am someone? Is that like, anyway, it gets more complicated, too complicated, one might
Never.
say. And
For
I guess the
history,
real,
yes.
I'll end it by saying, and you mentioned this in the episode, where's the line, right? Because where's the line? Meaning, he mentioned that if Hitler wrote the greatest poetry, he still wouldn't read that poetry. So is it that you said earlier, Washington, we take the good and the bad? But when is the bad so bad that the good isn't worth it? And when is the good so good that the bad doesn't matter? If Hitler donated $1 billion to, saving humanity, does that negate, like, and don't answer that. I'm just saying, I'm using
I would
extreme
definitely like
example.
us to not necessarily. I totally understand because they talk about it in the episode, but we
I'm
definitely.
using an extreme example to prove a
Sure.
point, though. Like, how there is obviously a point where no amount of good is going to outweigh the most extreme of bads, which I would argue is easier to say than no amount of bad can outdo an extreme of good, because I would argue that you can, can't overlook some of the atrocities. It's just interesting. It's interesting that net Washington is a positive, or some of these people are positives.
The point is, I think actually the better answer to that, or just kind of thinking about it, is like, it doesn't matter. It all needs to be told, and then each person will
conversations.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we don't necessarily have to draw that line in the sand. I don't support people who would read Hitler's poetry, but if he was the best poet ever, I mean, again, subjective art.
Or would you hang?
Would you read it? Like, it's so, that's such a
house?
weird. Yeah, but no.
I'm going to give us a point to edit to. I guess I'm going to come around full circle. In fact, maybe we just keep all this in. But listen, I think we made a really good point in this post show, which is the same one we really make every show. This is complicated. This is complicated.
Use the name of the show in the show.
It's almost like we planned this. Like, it's crazy.
I know.
Yeah.
No, but this is why hearing out the Humanity Archive, listening to the podcast, reading the book, continuing the education, going to his website, listening to Too Complicated for History, educating yourself, both sides. As Jermaine Fowler said on the episode, he has books that he completely disagrees with. Why does he have them? Because he wants to read both sides, come to his own conclusions, which is really the only thing that we can ask of our audience, which is educate yourself, make a decision for yourself. Don't take my word for it, Pat, Lynn, Jermaine, Isaac. Don't take anyone's word for it. Educate yourself. And that was Pat. On that note, guys, thank you so much for joining me on this 8th episode. Please check out the Humanity Archive at the Humanity Archive. I'll put it back on the screen. It's all over the place. Please listen to Too Complicated for History, our 8th episode with Jermaine Fowler. And thanks again for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jordan.